I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. This week, we've got another listener crit episode for you. Cameron is back. Cameron had been away a little bit, but he's back, and he'll be back again next week for the long-delayed AMA. But this week, we talked about 3 listener poems. If you are a subscriber to The Secret Show, you can go to sleerickets.substack.com to sign up. You can send in poems for listener crit. So we do frank, anonymous critiques of poems from listeners using just an initial and talk about what works, what doesn't work, and how we might look at revision. Cameron and I had a lot of fun digging into these 3 poems. And then in the second part of the show, on the Secret Show feed, we continued on a little bit about C, the poem from the third poem. In addition to talking about some strategies for emotion testing in poetry, we also talked about romanticism, editing literary matters, and some rants Cameron had about a recent episode of the show that he only half listened to. It is as passionate, insightful, and dubiously founded a rant as you could ask for. Go to sleerickets.substack.com to check that out. You can put in your email address and they'll give you a week's access for free. After that, it's really fucking cheap. Just before getting to the episode, though, I wanted to mention that Alice and I have a conversation out in Poetry London's Substack. It's actually Poetry London's website and on their Substack. It's a conversation that we recorded and edited, and you can read it in print, slightly surreally, about what it's like doing a podcast about poetry. So it was a lot of fun to talk to her, as always, and thank you to Neil Campbell for running it. It's called Lazy Montaignes, and it is up now both on Substack and at Poetry London's website. Go give it a read. So yeah, let's start with these poems. We've had a couple of listener crits. I did finally record one with Alice that's going to come out this week, and then we've been trying to record this one for ages and had a number of false starts and technical collapses. But yeah, we're going to make it happen now.
Yeah, we're trying. Yeah. Okay. Do you want to read the poems or the poem?
Sure, yeah. Do you want to, let's see, how should we begin? So we have 3 we're going to talk about. So on the set I did with Alice, there's another poem by W. He sent in 2. I spoke to him some off mic about this short one. And because it's so slight, I figured we could mention it as well because this was just a short thing. And then I had a note from off mic, and then we also talked about his other poem at more length with Alice. So yeah, we can just quickly look at this little short thing that he sent in. Yeah. Every journey begins with a stumble by W. I was wiping blood from my philtrum when the phone rang. Hi, Mum, I said, though 2 years had passed. Spooky to get a call from the beyond. And this was a doozy. Words shining and fading. You must chang your liff. What? I said. What? And this is why I had no choice. So the thing that's tricky to read is that you have 3 words in this that have the last letter, which is an E in all 3 cases, cut off of them. And also in all 3 cases, the pronunciation is affected in a way that is inconsistent with the pronunciation of the original word.
Right.
So you must change your life, the line from Rilke in Stephen Mitchell's translation, Du musst dein Leben ändern. But we lose the E from change and from life, so it's CHANGLIF. And then the last line of the poem is, and this is why I had no choice, but the E from choice is cut off. So
yeah,
I thoughts on that, but yeah, before I get into that, maybe I'll just read through it one more time with that in mind, so people can kind of know what they're hearing. Every journey begins with a stumble by W. I was wiping blood from my philtrum when The phone rang. "Hi, Mum," I said, though 2 years had passed. Spooky to get a call from the beyond. And this was a doozy. Words shining and fading. "You must chang your lif." "What?" I said. "What?" And this is why I had no choice. So again, I don't know how to pronounce those, but
Yeah.
yeah, philtrum being the little dip in your front lip, if I'm not mistaken. I believe that's what philtrum is.
I was wondering.
Yeah,
I was
it's
waiting for you to tell me.
yeah. I always confuse it with the frenellum. Yeah, the philtrum is the dip in the upper lip, and the frenellum is the connective tissue in your tongue. Is in your tongue, or is it in your between your lip and your? There's one that the beloved figure skater frenulum. Oh, there's a penile frenulum. No, there's something I forget. Anyway, she pierced the figure skater everybody loves, Alyssa Liu. It looks like she has something on her teeth, but she pierced the little connective membrane between your front gums and your upper lip.
Oh, yes.
So she has a
Yeah,
little thing that hangs down in front of her teeth.
right.
Seems like a dentally dubious decision, but she's a star.
Yeah. Yeah. An orthodontist once threatened to remove that. They were like, well, if his teeth doesn't move back, we can then remove. And I guess they said how do you say, the
Well, no,
frenulum.
I don't know because when I looked up I thought it was frenellum, but then
Frenulum.
frenulum came up and it was just the little membrane at the head of your cock. So like right, I don't know how to describe it. Like just below the kind of the urethral opening,
Thank
little
fuck they
like
didn't
membrane.
remove.
Yeah, you hope they didn't remove that. Yeah, yeah,
I thought I had it bad when they tried to remove part of my lip, but Jesus Christ,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. All right. So yeah, every journey begins with a stumble. Do you there's a poem that immediately came to mind by Andrea. It's Andrea Cohen's, probably her best known poem.
I don't think I know her.
She is an American poet. I enjoy her. She writes very, very short
Okay.
poems.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The Committee Weighs In. Yeah. So this is The Committee Weighs In by Andrea Cohen. "I tell my mother I've won the Nobel Prize. Again, she says. Which discipline this time? It's a little game we play. I pretend I'm somebody. She pretends she isn't dead." So that's the poem that came to mind when I read this one initially. This little tiny poem about being on the phone with a dead mom.
I really have two thoughts, and I think one of those thoughts is more of a speculation or a sort of a conversation. Okay, I think if either of my thoughts are helpful, here's my slightly more helpful thought, which is, as you say, the poem is titled "Every Step Begins with a
Every
Stumble."
journey begins with a stumble.
Sorry, every journey begins with a stumble. My bad. Every journey begins with a stumble. I think this is the weakest part of the poem. I was thinking if you change that to something like, and again, this is not quite an exact suggestion, but it's sort of just a thematically similar suggestion. But if you change it to something like an excuse, or, and again, this is not a suggestion, but just sort of a way of an explanation of my thinking. But if you change it to something like an explanation for how I behaved or something, or just something on that arena of presenting the poem as a kind of an excuse or an explanation for some kind of not even wrongdoing, but just some kind of implied strangeness. I think that would elevate the content much higher than I think the kind of pseudo philosophy of this title does. I think the title is really where the sort of terseness of the poem is let down,
Yeah.
and I think it doesn't introduce enough. It reveals too much without giving enough of a sort of a conceptual hook, an
Yeah. Yeah.
explanation
Yeah.
which is exciting and mysterious for the actual content. And if you just called it an excuse, then even that is just reframing the poem and giving a certain kind of a sense of an explanation of wrongdoing or strangeness that I think at least would charge the contents of the poem with something that would add to its meaning. So like that's my helpful comment. My other comment would be I'm very interested in this kind of thing with its very sort of short lines. I would say there's on a whole 1 to 2 beats per line, though they sometimes expand. But I'm interested both in sort of your opinion and just in my kind of grasping of the poem. But do you how do you find like the lines as sonic and conceptual units? Do you think that kind of work into the poem's advantage, or do you think they're not really doing anything for you in making the poem what it is?
Yeah, good question. I definitely don't. I think my impulse as soon as I see that the poem is written in something both in a very talky register and in seemingly free verse is I tend to mostly disregard the line breaks. I know that's heresy to free verse poets, but I think
Yeah,
because free verse poets have so few formal and this poet actually does write in meter and rhyme sometimes,
yeah,
but I think because free verse poets have so few formal constraints, they tend to get possessive of the ones they have, which is why it tends to be free verse poets who get really excited about whether or not you're doing things like initial line caps. Whereas I think like, what? Who cares? Like what? But yeah, I think if there's a line break here that feels like it doesn't, Alan Shapiro talks about, because he writes mostly in free verse, though he also has a lot of formal experience. He talks about phrasal verses in jammed free verse. And when he says in jammed, he means sort of hard, abrupt in jammets versus free verse that basically is just breaking up the lines at places where you have a natural break in the phrase or the clause. And this one is basically phrasal free verse. The line breaks are at sort of conceptually natural places in the
yeah.
poem. Though 2 years had passed, that feels to me like the weakest line break in the poem.
Can I
Maybe it's
just
just because there's
can I,
less there's like we learn almost nothing after the line break, and it doesn't feel like either of those lines has a punch to it that they wouldn't have more clearly together. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
no, I was gonna say, can I just briefly read the poem with sort of spaces added for the line breaks,
Yeah,
just
yeah,
for
yeah,
the.
yeah, yeah. Good idea.
So it says, obviously every journey begins with a stumble. I was wiping blood from my philtrum when the phone rang. Hi, Mum, I said, though 2 years had passed. Spooky to get a call from the beyond. And this was a doozy. Words shining and fading. You must chang your lif. What? I said, what? And this is why I had no choice. And that is obviously the end of it.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean, it's basically, yeah, as you say, like each line is a little fret, like it's basically broken on the scheme of the clause, right? Like it's each
Yeah, yeah,
clause
yeah.
an
Clause or
individual.
phrase, yeah, little natural, like natural grammatical moments,
Yeah,
breaks in the poem. You like where the sentence, if it were an organism, would have joints.
yeah, yeah,
You're
yeah,
carving nature, you're carving grammar at the joints, as whichever philosopher would have said. Should say I agree with you very much about the title being. I hadn't thought of it before, but the title does feel to me like a false step, no pun intended. Partly because I think it betrays what is one of the poem's great strengths, which is the tone,
yeah,
the balance of tone in this poem, where it's sort of you have this casual bl- blood on the philtrum. We don't know exactly why. Maybe it's just a nosebleed. Maybe it's something else. The
yeah,
cheerful phone call with a dead mom, and then part of what I really like about it, and part of where I think like the game with cutting off the letters from the words really doesn't serve the poem well, is that I think that there's something really funny about, particularly given that we have the Rilke poem, Art Characters of Apollo, that famously ends with the "You must change your life," about having your dead mom calls you on the phone and she gives you a message and it says, and this one was a doozy, words shining and fading, and her message is, "You must change your life," and in the poem it's all in all caps, and your response is,
yeah,
"What?" Sorry, what? Like you can't hear her clearly or you don't understand what she's saying. There's something so funny about that. The last line, and this is why I had no choice with the line with the letter cut off of choice, feels like it maybe is echoing whatever that sentiment of the title is. And I think I'm with you in that it is going to be both more emotionally effective and I think more and I think ultimately wiser to withdraw any attempt at conveying wisdom.
yeah,
Like don't try to offer a reading or an interpretation. It reminds me of the thing that my promising young poet does, which is she'll have these sort of slightly surreal poems where these different tones and different concerns collide, but then her tendency sometimes is to try to give a title that's a sort of an explanatory moral or lesson, and I think it's almost always the wrong impulse.
Oh,
Like
yeah,
pull back, give a gesture that adds a little extra flavor of something, but don't try to interpret for us.
yeah, 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 yeah.
I think partly because you just have it's I think because what you're removing from these words is letters and the way that they're being conveyed, even in the context of the poem itself, not just because we're reading it aloud, but like in the context of the poem, the first time we encounter those words with a letter missing, not only is it in every single case a letter that doesn't add a sound of its own, but rather changes the way a previous letter is pronounced, but also in that first encounter, you must change your life. That is somebody speaking aloud, and he's receiving the information orally, auditorially. So to me, it just is so confusing how this is meant to be. What is it meant to sound like if she leaves off the silent last letter of two words while saying them aloud into your ear? Versus, I think like what came to mind partly because we were texting with Elijah before this is that you are constantly. I don't know if you voice to text or if you're like a terrible typer or whatever but like you have these
Yeah,
wonderful like mondegreens in your text where you're constantly saying one thing and then
yeah,
having the text slightly mangle it so that you were writing about. My joke was that you needed to write a sexy gay ars poetica about foreman content, foreman, foreman content about a construction worker because you'd had that phrase appear in one of your texts. What was the one that in you had the great line
oh,
ridiculous fairies. It was furious fairies, but you were talking about theories. It wasn't fairies, it was theories. But I think like
yeah,
in a way, like that's the oral equivalent of a misspelling, right?
yeah,
Is actually a
yeah,
mishearing. So in
yeah,
a way, like there would be something funny and it would ring truer if your mom was trying to just simply tell you you must change your life from beyond the grave, but instead it like it got garbled and she ended up saying like a nonsense sentence with something that sounded like that. And I think
yeah, yeah,
particularly if it were a mondegreen of the kind that like the reader
right,
could easily interpret what was intended, but the
yeah,
speaker couldn't, that's
yeah,
actually really funny as an idea. So, like your mom
yeah,
has a very straightforward and very urgent message to you, and you just slightly miss it.
yeah. Your mum,
That's very funny. So
yeah,
again, like there's something I really like about this poem, but it just seems like it's not quite brought to the finish line.
yeah. I think we've both agreed that what the W needs to really write is a poem about their mum calling them up and saying you need to change your life, and they get a divorce or something. Like that's
Yeah, you must change your wife, right? Yeah,
yeah. But like yeah,
yeah,
no, I totally agree, and I think especially the choik or whatever, however you want to pronounce
yeah,
choi
yeah, yeah.
without the e. I vaguely see the mimetic humor of that final line, but since it's the narrator speaking, it's not the mother. I don't think it really works within the context, and I don't think it really either works in the kind of conceptual argument the poem's putting forward. Not to be mean to W, but I don't think the joke lands, and I
Yeah,
and I,
yeah, yeah.
you
Also,
know
because in all three cases, Chang,
yeah,
Lif, and Choik,
right,
it's not you don't get a new word. I mean,
yeah, yeah,
Chang is a proper
yeah,
name, I guess, of some people, but like you don't. It's not like the word gets transformed into another word that could then convey another meaning. It's just
yeah.
obviously a misspelling or an incomplete version of an existing word.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And E is, as you say, E is a very problematic letter to remove, even just in
Yeah.
terms of pronunciation. So no, I think, yeah, I think I basically agreed that the poem suffers both from the title and from the misspelling. But I also
Yeah.
think the poem is very effective in I think in its general humor,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think it's on a structural basis. I think it's also doing the things it needs to do to be the thing it wants to be. So like
Yeah. Yeah.
I think none of these things are major in themselves overhauls.
No, and it. I mean, again, with the exception of the title and to a lesser degree the last line, it's a very credible and winning voice.
Yeah. No,
Yeah, thank you, W. We don't need to spend a ton of time on it, but yeah, I was glad to at least take a look at that.
yeah.
All right, so we got two others that are both formal. Are the not? They're not both sonnets. One is 16 lines and one is
One is
14. Are they both? No, wait. Yeah, yeah,
one is
14. Yeah, one's a
sure.
sonnet. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, which do you want to start with? Briefly New Neighbors or The Self-Deceived?
Let's do briefly new neighbors because I
Okay.
find that a less com-
I'm going to try to not scratch my computer. I sometimes create noise by touching the
I
computer
can
with my
read it.
paper.
Read this one if you'd
Yeah, yeah,
prefer.
yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, so this is briefly new neighbors occupy the little house at the bottom of the lane by R. I don't, it has an epigraph.
Hmm.
Those who live no more echo still within our thoughts and words, and what they did is part of what we have become. And I never know how to say this name, but it's Shame, Chaim, Stern,
Yeah.
Shame. Do
I
you
think
know how
yeah,
to
I
say
think it's Chaim,
Chaim?
which is life in Hebrew. Chaim Stern.
Okay, and this is the sonnet. I became your newfound friend by June. We dawdle mornings over limericks. Your mum at home, a quiet afternoon, or nurse our dolls, or play at pick-up sticks. Hot nights outdoors, the earth a wonderland. We meet a doe who tiptoes from the trees, and lips an apple from your upturned hand. Another day, we watch the honeybees. That year, your mum worked as a nurse in town. No bro, no dad, as far as I could see. Your house tiny, calm, outside nut brown, inside both purposeful and fancy free. You welcomed me, another of your strays, a wonder of that time, those fleeting days.
It's I think overall, let's see, just looking at the meter and the rhyme to start with.
It's
Um,
Shakespeare
yeah,
in
Shakespearean English sonnet, ABAB, and so on to the couplet, GG.
yeah,
June, noon, limerick, sticks, wonderland, hand, trees, honeybees, town, brown, sea, free, strays, days. So true
pretty
rhyme
perfect
throughout, and
waveform.
with maybe a little bit of gentle wobbling in the stress because you know limericks and Wonderland, it's a slightly
Yeah.
secondary stress, but it's never wrenched. It's always still true. And I think that the meter is pretty
Mm,
clean and very regular with
yeah.
maybe one exception, which is by my lights line 11 wobbles a little bit. Your house tiny,
Mm,
calm, outside nut brown. And that's I think it's clearly a pentameter. It is the second position trochee and then a third position, maybe spondy, or if you don't believe in spondies, you could say it could go either way, trochee or iamb. And then are you missing are you a syllable short here?
I
Your
think she's
house
missing.
tiny, calm, outside nut brown. Yeah, I think you may be missing a syllable.
I think dash might stand for an unstressed syllable. Your
Yeah,
house.
there are two dashes, right?
Yeah, yeah. I don't think the second dash. So if one goes
Yeah.
your house, unstressed syllable, type
Yeah.
dash, outside nut brown. The second dash I don't think is standing for something, but I think
Yeah.
the first dash is standing for an unstressed syllable for tiny.
Yeah. So I mean, again, I think reading the poem as a whole, it's we know what we're reading. We don't get it's not there's nothing egregious, but I think in a sonnet in which the meter is so regular throughout, that line does stand out as being
Yeah,
notably irregular.
I agree.
Most of my questions are just about the precision of the language and the sharpening of the emotional effect. I
Uh-huh.
do think I have some problems with some of the diction, and then just clarity in what is because it's it's a memory poem, a reminiscence with a little bit of a bittersweet touch to it, but yeah, it feels like it's one where just like some fine tuning throughout could really enhance the overall effect. I don't imagine this is like your favorite kind of poem personally, but
Okay, so I wanted to talk to you about this poem.
Yeah.
My sense was almost existential. It's far too pretentious. Who am I? Paul France. I'm joking. I'm joking. I love, but my sense is of dissatisfaction. But I wanted to sort of ask you about it because I think you might be useful in both either demonstrating the ways in which I've missed things or demonstrating the ways in which I think. But like as at an emotional level, I guess here's my question. You're someone who's very interested in like, the lyric dramatic potential of poems, of demonstrating, the emotional complexities of human beings. So I guess my question is on this poem, do you feel like a particular emotional punch? And more specifically, if I remove the epigraph from this poem, if you just presented with the 14 lines,
Yeah.
how, after reading it, would you emotionally interpret the poem? How would you like what sense would the poem give you? Would it sort of give you a sort of emotional blow, or do you think you would just sort of read it as like a recollection, a memoir?
Yeah, I think it is a recollection. It is a memoir. I did think that what I think what you're referring to is that the epigraph says those who live no more
Mm,
echo still within our thoughts.
right.
So it's the suggestion being that the person the poem's about is dead.
Yeah.
I did think that it is a weighty, and if it is explanatory enough epigraph that I think I would cut it
Yeah.
regardless. I think like if you want the poem to have this effect, you want to go ahead and bake that into the title and the body of the poem itself. But yeah, I mean, I have a soft spot for a kind of poem that can accurately, and I think the key is briefly,
Uh-huh.
evoke a momentary emotional shift. Like there's a short story I really really like that my students always hate by Edward P. Jones called "An Orange Line Train to Ballston," and it's the whole thing is just this period of a few weeks in this woman's life. She's a single mom taking her
Uh-huh.
kids to school and herself to work on the subway and just having this sort of extended flirtation with a man where like things might happen or they might not, and they kind of come to a head and then it just doesn't happen, and then that period is over. And in the
Uh,
story, the complaint is that nothing happens. But I think what does happen is that there's sort of a possibility that is opened in her life and then is shut. And when the
Uh-huh.
story is over, that will not happen again. That
Uh,
something has been changed forever. And here, I think similarly, it sort of it captures one of these little fleeting episodes we have, particularly when we're younger, that is it's a sincere friendship and a connection, and whatever this happens certainly with erotic relationships, but it also happens with friendships where there's something that mattered and that was real, and then it's just over and gone. And to me,
sure.
like that's something worth capturing and worth conveying. But if you're going to do it, I think the key is you have to be brief and you have to be razor sharp in how you get it
Yeah.
across. I think the author has the brevity here, but I think it could be significantly sharpened throughout. And then I think you also just have to accept that this is not going to be a poem for every reader. But it is a poem. It is a kind of poem I appreciate when it's done really well. I think, like, honestly, it reminds me of some of Donald Justice's poems, or
Yeah.
which can be very quiet but really poignant when they're, and he sharpens them like nobody's business.
Okay, so that's interesting. Let me just very slightly just expand on my viewpoint, I think,
Yeah,
because you know I do, for all the rumor that I only like very complex modernist poems that no one can understand. For all that rumor that someone has been spreading around, I do like sharp poems. I do appreciate emotional sharpness and briefness, and also like a kind of melancholic holding up of a moment. My my criticisms are twofold. I think this poem fails. I think what this poem does very well is evoking a moment, evoking a relationship. I think that it does it quite well. I think it does it quite well in 12 lines. I think we've identified the main metrical stumbling block. At some point, will identify a particular line or a set of phrases that I think seem to me a weakness, but I certainly think the poem does that well. I think the poem is a little, at the moment, hamstrung by its form, in that I think it wants to package too much into its final couplet.
Uh-huh.
You welcomed me, another of your strays, full stop, new line,
Yeah.
a wonder of that time, those fleeting days. I
Yeah, yeah,
think
yeah.
if you removed the stern quote, I think that most readers would find that couplet unsatisfying. And I
Yeah.
don't particularly believe in poems relying on an external emotional steering wheel for their emotional impetus. I think the poet has simultaneously bound too many stakes up in the final couplet, and yet in the final couplet not produced those stakes. And I think in
Yeah, there I totally agree though,
gone.
and I think the last line is just an attempt to summarize what should be the effect of the poem overall, rather
Yeah,
than producing that effect. So yeah, I mean, I think the last line should go, and I think you're
yeah,
probably I hadn't thought about it, but I think you're probably right that this is it's a quiet poem and it's short, but it does sort of take its time in considering each of these little shards and memories. And I think there's something about the couplet that maybe is straining to wrap things up too tidily. And I think that maybe go ahead and just do one more quatrain instead
yeah, yeah,
is my instinct. And I'm with you. Yeah, cut the epigraph. What you don't want is to just get credit because the friend is now dead and have
yeah,
that sort of add an extra really having happenedness, a weight of really having happenedness to it, because that's not, to me, that's not a poetic effect. That's a different kind of effect. But yeah, I think you're quite right. I actually don't mind you welcomed me another of your strays. Now I think there, as in a number of other places, that the language points to some missing pieces or a little bit of imprecision. I mean, I thought like, well, wait, what were the other strays? And is there something notable about the welcome of this particular person? Was that not to be expected? And then, I mean, I think like maybe that last stanza is about the concepts you introduced there, but go
yeah,
ahead
yeah,
and
yeah.
let it be three more lines instead of just one that tries to put a button on it.
Well, like it's striking. I think an introductory note, or at least a note of change. It's striking a note that should be expanded on, but it's attempting to use that note as a kind of a turn and also a conclusion. And I just don't think those are working. Like, and I'm not exactly suggesting you should do this, but imagine if you began with that line, right? You welcomed me another of your strays. Like, that is such an interesting introductory line. It's not a useful concluding line because it just introduces too much
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
bland
yeah,
into the poem. And like, I
yeah,
think that's where the couplet is a constriction. And I think the Shakespearean sonnet ends with a couplet because the Shakespearean sonnet is, especially in Shakespeare's use, like a highly pressured chamber that's always heading towards some kind of explosion in the kind of romantic sexual lust that the Shakespearean sonnets present. But I don't think this sonnet is operating in that kind of highly pressurized atmosphere. It's trying to kind of unfold a more kind of Proustian, however you want to fucking say the French man's name, but a kind of Proustian journey into memory and into a kind of bittersweet melancholy.
yeah,
And I don't think the couplet serves that at all. I think the couplet blunts it and seems very rushed compared to the first 12 lines that are very exact, very exacting,
yeah,
very slow. You're being kind of brought through scenery, close up after close up, and then you're suddenly smashed into this like you know massive cut into a kind of wide view, and you don't know enough. You don't. It has an impact. You don't have enough emotional detail to be impacted by the sudden cut.
yeah,
And
yeah. Either the welcomedness or or the like that there's this person that collects strays in some sense. That those are those both seem like potentially really notable themes, but they're thrown in at the end, and then we're just given a line presenting their meaning as we should accept it. All of this
I,
was a wonder of those days. Well, but of the why why?
Well, I think the 14th line is even more grammatically confusing because if you follow from the 13th line, a wonder of those days seems to be applied to you welcomed me another of your strays, right? So the narrator becomes a wonder. But
Yeah,
if we go back to the poem, the only thing described as a wonderland, is the
yeah, yeah.
environment. You
But
know,
yeah, yeah, I mean, I think that, but this is also like I think that's a phrase. There, I was going to mark like there are a handful of phrases that seem like it is if you can tighten the real precision of all of your
Yeah.
language throughout, I think the whole poem is going to be so much more. It's going to have like Stoppard's a floor that's sprung like a dance floor.
Yeah.
And I think right now it's not quite built that way. If
Yeah.
just the things that leapt out to me
Uh-huh.
were one, I think. So suggests this is in response to the briefly. And I think that briefly is sort of key because it does suggest that this comes and it goes. New neighbors
Yeah.
occupy the little house at the bottom of the lane, so it's presumably it's in response to that title, the event of the title, which is another reason to cut the epigraph. Because let's just go. We are going straight from the title into the poem.
Yeah.
So I became your newfound friend by June. So to me, that's just like it's a very straightforward example of you get to the most important part of the line, and then you have a foot left, right? However you want to do it. I think by June is by far secondary or tertiary information compared to I became your newfound friend. Um,
Wait, so again, back up slightly. Are
yeah.
you objecting? I'm a little confused. Are you objecting to the use of so in the line, or are you
No,
objecting
no,
to?
no, no. I'm saying so. The so is in response to the event of the title,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
which is another reason to cut the epigraph.
Right.
Because the
Exactly. Okay.
epigraph then interrupts us after that title
Yeah.
before we get to the so responds to the neighbors occupy the little house at the bottom of the lane. The speaker already lived in this neighborhood. New people move in. So I became your friend. But the I
Uh-huh.
became your friend is the key information, and by June is a little detail added onto it, which should not come at the end of the line. The end of the line should be sort of we should get to the key moment and then break off.
Yeah.
Um, little things, but like we dawdle mornings over limericks. Your mom at home, a quiet afternoon. Grammatically, your mom at home, a quiet afternoon. Those are absolute phrases. So they are
Mm.
phrases that are meant to apply as a whole, as a modification of the independent clause. But the problem is that the independent clause takes place in the morning, and one of the absolute phrases is afternoons.
Right.
So I think you need to just this is where you just tighten what are you specifically saying? What are you specifically pointing to? And a poem in which a lot of it is listing, which is totally fair. Give us a list, but just make sure that you're presenting your list in a way that's grammatically coherent.
Right. Right.
Nurse our dolls or play at pickup sticks. I circled at just because there's something about that that felt like maybe a little bit funny as a casual speaking voice. Hot nights outdoors, the earth a wonderland. The earth a wonderland feels to me very broad and a little bit grand and not. And again, like what it's the
Just
small particulars that are going to sell this poem for us. And the earth a wonderland is a big sweeping kind of claim that feels to me like I don't know why I should either believe it or find it to be especially pertinent to this particular story. We meet a
I
doe
also
who tiptoes from the trees and lips an apple from your upturned hand. Maybe that literally happened in exactly those terms. Maybe, I mean, the first thought I had was, are does' mouths like a does for a doe to eat out of a human's hand is unusual because they tend to be very skittish. But B, is a doe's mouth big enough to eat a whole apple, or maybe it's a crab apple? Maybe it's fine. I mean, the image, of course, that comes to mind is a horse, both because the horses are domesticated and because they're bigger. But whether that's just a literal account of something that literally happened or not, I'm just marking that I noted it there. I also noted there's a tense shift. There's a couple places where we wobble from past to present. You want to keep an eye on.
yeah.
Another day we watched the honeybees that year. No bro is the wrong register.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it fits the meter, but the register is wrong there. No dad, as far as I could see. Your house, yeah, the meter I didn't love in that line. Inside, both purposeful and fancy free. I, that to me, that was again, that was sort of that was an assessment that defies description. Fancy free is very hard for me to imagine in a house, and it was an assessment of. I mean, purposeful is one thing that I feel like I could imagine there being something about the speaker who finds the way that this other family lived to be alluring, which happens all the time as a kid because it's different from your own. But I raised my eyebrow at both purposeful and fancy free, and then of course you welcomed me another of your strays. I just thought like, well, is it something? Is there something truly notable about this friend welcoming you when this friend is new to the neighborhood? And what is the sense in which you are another of her strays? Even if you just give us one line where you refer to her collecting animals or collecting something, that would
Hmm.
give us some other sense of why this was meaningful. but I think, yeah, overall, I mean, I was I was won over by the voice and won over by the little
Oh,
reminiscence, but I think just keep it precise and keep your grammar really, really tightly fine tuned, and let us just experience these little moments as they are without a lot of summary statements about what they
yeah.
meant.
I just to add to your line by line criticisms, I would say or nurse our dolls or play at pick and mix. I think that
Pick up
line.
sticks.
Sorry, pickups. No, I always get pick up mix. Fuck me. Yeah, pick up sticks. My apologies to R. Or nurse our dolls or play at pick up sticks. The two ors in that line you can probably get away with. My sense slightly twinges at that, but I'm probably being hypersensitive. I think Wonderland is an incorrect term because the lines that follow Wonderland that are kind of implicitly evoking what Wonderland suggests. We meet a doe who tiptoes from the trees and lips an apple from your upturned hand. Another day we watch the honeybees. I don't think that's quite what Wonderland means. Wonderland, of course, inevitably evokes Carol, and Lewis Carroll, Dodson, whatever you want to call him, is a writer of a kind of absurd, fantastical evocation of the kind of nightmare of childhood. This is not what these lines are doing. These lines are evoking a kind of, I guess, startlingly anthropomorphic, or at least startlingly human favored, but still pretty animalistic kingdom. But I don't think it has the kind of surrealist wonder of Carol. And my sense is that Wonderland is an overly easily reached for rhyme that doesn't quite evoke or doesn't. It's I don't know. It seems kind of slapdash to me
Yeah.
in a
Well, yeah,
darkly
and
way.
whatever you want to convey, I think you convey it much more effectively with this little vignette
Right.
about the dough. You know, like if maybe it slightly strains adult credulity, or maybe it was just a truly remarkable event.
Yeah.
But either way, we take away plenty from that little description of a dough eating out of your hand or the friend's hand that the Earth of Wonderland doesn't add to that
No.
impression we have. And then if you want, I mean, well, I don't know. I mean, I think it could go either way. But another day we watch the honeybees
Do you
does
like
feel
that
a
line?
little bit like a loss of the. We're definitely not
Oh,
escalating from the dough, but both of those give us a sense of a setting in a way that the Earth of Wonderland feels like a vague and maybe not especially accurate summary.
well, I was gonna say that another day we watched the honeybees, line 8. I think when placed in context with the end of line 5, which is the Earth of Wonderland, I think line 8 is maybe the worst line of the poem, and it's not a travesty of phrasing or of meter, but it's not just it's unremarkable. I think it's pretty lazy. Like it answers the rhyme scheme and it follows the metric, but it has no imagination in it. I mean, if you're going to say the Earth of Wonderland and just saying we watched some honeybees, that's not an evocation of a wonderland. Like, I don't know, people have been writing meter for 2,000 years. Making a good poem isn't just about putting 10 syllables in a line and
Yeah,
making it all
yeah, yeah.
rhyme. So I think I don't know. I find line 8 to me seems the most obnoxiously bad line in the poem because
I don't,
it
that seems harsh, but
no offense to R, but like it satisfies everything it should satisfy, and yet it seems entirely hollow to me. Like,
yeah.
okay, you watch some honeybees, that's great. What does that evocate? That there were bees? That you and your friend watched the bees? Like, what are you trying to tell me that your friendship was based on watching bees? You're trying to tell me
Well,
that
yeah. I mean,
yeah,
yeah, I think particularly coming at the end of the eighth line, where we're maybe expecting a significant development before the what would have been the sestet before it, in an earlier kind of sonnet. It
yeah,
may be a little bit of a an uneventful line. I do think that if you just remove the Earth a Wonderland, so that that's not the
yeah.
introduction to these three lines about the
Mm.
doe and the apple and the honeybees, then I think it turns down our sensitivity a little bit and it allows us just to appreciate these quiet moments as they are without being told what they mean.
I think you're right there. Yeah. I want to also look at these lines. Your house, M dash, tiny, calm, M dash, outside, nut brown, inside, both purposeful and fancy free. I think what's particularly wrong with these lines for me is that they have a false parallelism in them. Outside, the house is described in terms of color, right? Outside, the house is not brown. But inside, we're expecting color again. We're expecting a kind of contrast in the same
Yeah.
kind of mode. But you don't give us, you terrible poet. No, I'm joking.
Yeah.
But the poem doesn't give us that contrast. It gives us instead, I think, a disjunctive note between a description of color, not brown, and inside is purposeful and fancy free. And
Yeah. 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 They're abstract assessments.
well, they're both abstractions, and I think they're completely. And I think they're even worse because I think that abstract nature is really brought out by the fact that they're like parallelistically contrasted with color, and I think that really like damages their description further. Like if you said outside, I don't know, playful like the town, I don't know, what something like if you just described it in more abstract descriptions, that still wouldn't be great. And I'm not saying you should do that, please don't. But I think it doesn't quite have the terrible note of comparing color against abstract description. And I think that seems to me a particularly like just it's disjunctively odd in a way that seems very noticeable to me. So if you can like bring something more concrete, more colorful into the line describing the inside of the house, I think that would be quite useful.
Well, no, I was going to say because I do think there's some space in the poem for I think you can do some fine tuning, and then there's a little bit of space in the poem with the Earth of Wonderland, with the inside both purposeful and fancy free, and then with what I think both of us, at least our instinct is that you can go ahead and make take the last couplet and make it be a last quatrain. There's some room in the poem not just to tighten or to sharpen the elements that are already there, but maybe to add a little bit more. And I think if I imagine an element that feels like it's perhaps missing, part of what I like about this is that it's a portrait of quiet, not fantastical or not ecstatic, but an idyll, a kind of a domestic pastoral. And there's a suggestion in it that this is contrasted with something else. Now I think you could slightly heighten that suggestion. I think of Amy Hempel has basically all of her short stories are about people acting normal while just below the surface something terrible has happened. Or she has a wonderful story called Today Will Be a Quiet Day, about a father taking his son and daughter out for a ride in the car, and they get burgers and they have a nice day together. But there's a simmering sense that today is a nice day, but it's not usually like this.
Right.
Or there's Bell Boggs has a great short story called Good News in a Hard Time, which has a similar kind of operation. Or the other two examples I thought of were My Papa's Waltz and Those Winter Sundays, the Rufke and the Haydn. And in both of those, in My Papa's Waltz, it's almost heavy-handed, that the whiskey on your breath, I hung on like death. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. Every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle, as plenty of people have pointed out. There's a suggestion that, although this is a poem about having a fun, playful time with your father, there's real violence and danger, and that maybe there were plenty of other times when it was not playful, and it might have been the violence, may have included the boy. The subtler instance is Those Winter Sundays, where it's just the cold practicality of the father's demonstration of love and the son's reluctance to acknowledge him even is only given any context by the reader's assumptions, and then the line, slowly I would rise and dress, and then the line, fearing the chronic angers of that house. That's all he gives us, but it's enough to let us know that he's remembering one very good note from a domestic situation that was often not that at all. And I think here, I'm not suggesting that either this household or the other household were abusive, but it does feel to me like there's something that really matters about this connection and this sort of haven in the other person's house, that it is in contrast to something. There's some kind of whether it's the threat of an existing parent, or maybe it's just an instability in one situation, either for the speaker or for this girl. Does she move around a lot? Is that what's happening? Her mom works in town as a nurse one year, but I think you have the opportunity to give us just a little hint of what might make this quiet portrait all the more precious,
Yeah.
or what it stands in contrast to.
I agree. I think there's too much. I think the description is not weighed enough against the insinuation as it is in those winter Sundays, and I think that is what is required by the poem.
But yeah, I think this is like, yeah, I think this is a good draft, and I'm excited to see where it goes. All right. Should we look at the self-deceived?
Yep.
All right, this
Whenever
is
you're
the
ready.
self-deceived by C. The con man knows the deepest dread you'll never face directly lies in knowing loved ones in your head are spun from threads your head supplies. While loved ones elsewhere don't exist, to love one must apprehend. So, eyes averted, you persist in faith your dearest friend's your friend. The con man knows you'll doubt the part, but not the whole. His words are true expressions, not of fact or heart, but what he wills his words to do. His ministrations are as warm and intimate as surgery. His bliss alone above the storm confirms his choice to never be.
Yeah, an interesting poem.
Yeah, yeah.
We've been trying to do this episode, I think, several times now, and of all the poems you've sent me to critique, this one I think is definitely the one that's lingered in my mind. In that when I reread it's always somewhat familiar, which I think is a sign of its own kind of skill and impressiveness, both psychology and I think poetic expression of something true and interesting.
Yeah, this is in quatrains. They're ABAB. Is it consistent throughout? Yes,
I
ABAB,
am
all true rhyme, and they're I think it's all tetrameter, I believe.
Yeah, sorry, that's why I said tetrameter.
Yeah,
My
yeah,
bad.
yeah. So, I mean, a number of different things come to mind. I think we mentioned in other earlier attempts that the title, "The Self-Deceived," calls to mind both Larkin's "The Less Deceived," which is the name of the collection that then contains a poem called "Deceptions," about a woman who's raped, and his argument is that he says, "For you would hardly," speaking to the victim, he says, "For you would hardly care that you were less deceived out on that bed than he was, stumbling up the breathless stair to burst into fulfillment's desolate attic." The construction, "the less deceived," is also borrowed or adapted from Hamlet, where Ophelia says, "I
Right.
was the more deceived." And then
Yeah.
the other title that comes to mind is "The Self-Unseeing" by Hardy. Those two, yeah, come very much to mind reading it. And then, yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on it. You want to weigh in before we go further?
Yeah, sure. I think also the metric and the general techne, but especially in the metric and the rhyme scheme, and in its kind of laying out on the conceptual level, and that kind of the movement from the kind of general conceptual to kind of drilling down to not quite the personal, but certainly to the intimate, definitely reminds me a lot of Dickinson's kind of maneuvering within a very similar kind of poetics. And I have criticisms of this poem. I think I have a lot of criticisms on the grammatical level, especially. But it's certainly, I think, when I think about the poems I've read, not just in general, but just for critiques for this podcast, and not just the three poems we're talking about now, but just all the poems I've well not all all is a small number, but the number of poems I've critiqued for this podcast, I think this one is definitely, I would like to say, that maybe one of the most, not just imaginatively real, but I think also the most imaginatively exciting in its evocation of consciousness and behavior. And I think I all my criticisms, I would just like to say that I really like it. I really appreciate, I think, what the poet's trying to do here, and I really appreciate how intensely compound the language is at trying to get at that thing. And I think that those are no small victories. Those are big victories. Those are
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
imaginative, empathetic successes. And I think that the poem deserves its due as like
Yeah.
an imaginative, empathetic, brutally cruel success at getting at something.
Yeah.
Um, so those are my positive comments.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean it is a real technical feat in a way that like often with these poems, whether it's you or me or Alice, the feedback will in part be like, well, let's make sure you get your technique really, really crisp. And here
Yeah.
it's all crisp. It's all
Oh, for
quite
sure. Yeah.
quite tightly built, not just prosodically and the rhyme is all just exactly true,
It's
but it's
wound,
also,
right?
yeah, it's also very smartly thought and spoken. So it's, I mean, just as a technical feat, it is really impressive.
Okay, so I think my biggest criticism of the poem is that I think at several turns I think problematizes its syntax in a way that I don't think is useful. I'm just going to read it through. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to read it through until I reach a point that I think is problematic, and I'm going to stop and comment on it. But here we go. The con man knows the deepest dread you'll never face directly lies in knowing loved ones in your head are spun from threads your head supplies, while loved ones elsewhere don't exist. And here we go. To loved ones, one must
To love
apprehend.
one.
To love one must apprehend, semicolon. So, M dash, eyes averted, M dash, you persist in faith, your dearest friend's your friend. And I think the first quatrain, especially, let me just repeat it one more time. The con man knows the deepest dread you'll never face directly lies in knowing loved ones in your head are spun from threads your head supplies. I think that's a wonderful couplet. I think a wonderful quatrain. I think it moves for like a perfect speed for the rhyme, for the meter. Every rhyme, every every musical sound seems not just perfectly echoing the other rhyme, but also seems perfectly chosen for the subject. There's a kind of there's a both what Yeats talks about like a simultaneous strangeness and appropriateness to every word choice in that first four lines. It's like both truly beautiful, but also truly perceptive. That I think are just they're just wonderful, and like I think like you would be wrong to not appreciate
Yeah.
that
Oh, yeah.
force, that power, and that accuracy. But I think on line 5, while loved ones elsewhere don't exist, M dash, to love one, comma, one must apprehend. I think we're now straying into like grammatical over excess. I think loved ones at this point has been repeated too much
Yeah.
that it's beginning to disintegrate. There's a kind. I do think the poet is attempting to pun on loved ones, right? With to love
Right. To
one,
love
one
one,
must
which is grammatically is a
apprehend.
different construction than loved one.
Right. And they're trying to sort of present you these different kind of syntactical, semantic versions of loved one, as opposed to love one must apprehend. But I think it's not that it's failing because it's wrong. It's failing because it's all clenched too much together, and I think it's disintegrating because it's pushing at the level of sense in a way that I don't think is commensurate to the poem's idea. The poem doesn't want language to push at sense in a way that disfigures sense. The poem wants language to demonstrate the logic of sense, the logic of the con artist, the logic of confusion and disruption. But I don't think these lines present that logic. I think these lines simply enact a kind of confusion and disruption. I think like at this point it becomes hard to understand quite what the poem means. While loved ones elsewhere don't exist, to love one must apprehend. So, eyes averted, you persist. In faith, your dearest friend's your friend. There's too many repetitions. There's too many syntactic movements that are not quite logical, or not logical, but not quite clear enough to, be perfectly understood at even the secondary reading. And
Yeah.
I think this stanza, in some sense, semantically brings down the poem's force by complicating it too much with, syntactic confusion. But I'd be interested, obviously, in your
Yeah.
thoughts on that.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't disagree with what you've said, and I think particularly that the sixth line, while loved ones elsewhere don't exist, is the fifth line, and then
Uh-huh.
M dash to love one must apprehend. I think that there in particular, I think every time I've read the poem, I've had to stop and reread it. Right.
Right.
The thought that came to mind was this is part of what is impressive about this poem is that it's not just trying to do one thing. It is actually trying to think in lines
Yeah.
as well as sort of like providing a like the pleasure of verse and a kind of a
Yeah.
compact little lyric expression. But
Oh,
it's
like, and
yeah,
sorry, I don't interrupt you, but I just want to say that like most people don't do that. I think like
no,
Dickinson in this form especially does that, and Shakespeare in a different form
yeah,
does that. But like, it's extremely admirable when you see a poet trying to do that, and especially if this poem, even when several things don't come off, a lot of things do come off, and I think it's incredibly impressive the kind of compact cognition you see in this kind of poem.
yeah. And well, and I think as you've said, and even talking with Elijah about things like building a culture, or I've mentioned like the world championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana consisted of 14 consecutive ties, but in the process of it, that much intense pressure like advanced the theory on the kinds of positions they were playing by like decades. And I think what you definitely see here is that when you put this sort of pressure on lines, you begin to get some magical results.
Yeah.
That's this is sort of the case for poetry as compression.
Yeah.
Now, I think the problem is that you also sometimes you get into trouble with. I mean, it's a thing I experience all the time in my poems, which is ooh, I've got a really cool concept. Let me see if I can get this down, and I'll start to get some of it down, but then I want to complete the thought.
Uh-huh.
And at a certain point, the poem starts suffering. I managed to get the thought down on the page at the expense of the poem. And I think here,
Wait, sorry. Could you just expand on what you mean by at the expense of the poem?
well, I will find that I've filled out the lines or the stanzas in a way that is true to my conceptual argument while losing the thread of what would keep an indifferent stranger wanting to read this,
Okay.
and what would also maybe stir a feeling of recognition
Uh-huh.
versus just a clearly expressed theory related in verse. And I think here you've got a
Uh-huh.
good concept, but it ends up getting complicated enough that I think I mean, again, Hardy came to mind again and again and again. What he's so good at is I mean, he does it in his epitaphs. He has a lot of these epitaphs for epitaph for a cynic, epitaph for a pessimist, epitaph for this, for that, for the other. And they're,
Yeah.
they're little throwaway, quatrains usually, but he's very good at conveying a worldview through a sentimental experience
Yeah.
rather than just like articulating the technical parameters of the belief. And I
Yeah.
think here we start to get into like it starts to feel like you're choosing to convey all of the wrinkles of this particular concept at the expense of not just a grammatically, but it is, I think grammatically it all does technically hold. You're not agrammatical here anywhere, but like a, at the expense of a voice and of an emotion that is itself coherent.
Uh-huh.
So I think even, and this becomes, it's funny because to me, the poem begins to lose us. The second stanza is clear enough, but it's hard to follow. And then the third stanza, we start to lose even the specificity of the concept because it does seem like we're getting vague about what even is happening. The con man knows you'll doubt the part, but not the whole. And then you give 2.5 lines to his words are true expressions, not of fact or heart, but what he wills his words to do, which is if anything like that's what's already conveyed by the term con man. So it
Right.
does feel like we're kind of losing the plot on what exactly are we hearing about. And then I think it's funny. it's sort of after, but again, this may be some of the magic of compression. Like after you've done the hard work of, and all of these are, even when they're not my favorite saint, like all of these are really hard work to build. Like a
Yeah.
lot of effort and thought and care and
Uh-huh.
practice goes into making stanzas like this line up as cleanly as they do here. But it's after having done all of that and started to lose, like, what are we even talking about? What is the specific, what happened to the victim? What is the con man doing? It's then we get to, by my lights, like the by far the best lines in the poem. His ministrations are as warm and intimate as surgery. That by my
Okay.
lights, that's poetry. That like that's
I,
it's evocative.
I
It's convincing. It's precise as a comparison, and it's immediately credible.
I wanted to talk to you about those
Yeah,
lines because
please.
my experience of those lines was first, wow, that's very impressive. That's very exciting. My second response was, well, I've never had very intense surgery. I've never been put out. I've never been anesthetized. Is surgery warm? And like, I get like, it became a whole crux for me because I was like, well, these lines are very beautiful. These lines are very intense. They serve the driving, pounding metric of the poem, the driving, pounding thought process of the
Yeah,
poem very well. But everything comes down to whether surgery is warm. And
yeah,
having not really had surgery on myself, like I was kind of
yeah.
left at a loss because I was like, is
Well,
surgery warm or is
well, you
surgery
don't. Well,
cold?
for the person experiencing it, you're out. you don't
Right.
you don't experience it. But I mean, so one thing they do turn the temperature in the room as far down as possible because
Uh-huh.
people will. And again, like the popular misconception is that
Uh-huh.
you will faint at the surgical table because what you're seeing is so gross and upsetting. That is not why people faint. They
You
faint
poor.
because they're wrapped up in lots of gowns and they're standing for 8 to 10 hours at a time, and they lock their knees, and then the blood, they lose blood in their head, and that's why they faint.
Okay.
So they turn the temperature down as much as possible so you don't get overheated. But can I read you? This is it's about
Yeah.
a 1 page poem, but truly this was I met my wife. I found her attractive. I liked her as a person. I enjoyed talking to her. But then
Mm-hmm.
this was the first poem of hers that I read. And when I read
Okay.
it, I thought, oh, she's actually a good writer. Like, it's not just that I find her attractive and that she's sort of fun to talk to. Like, she is actually an honest to God real writer.
Sorry, before you read it, can I
Yeah.
ask, this in her first book, which I think I've read?
Yes, it is in her first
Okay.
book. But this is the very, very first poem of hers I read, long before that book existed. And this was when she was taking a break in the middle of medical school to get an MFA. So the poem is called Ministrations, which is why it came to mind when I read this poem. Ministrations. Sometimes the gentlest patient in the emergency room is from the city prison. This one, too, soft voiced, lifting his large dark eyes. He whispers, "Yes, ma'am," shy as a deer, young and brown-skinned with loosely muscled limbs gangling off the bed. His clean, uncoiled anatomy is almost embarrassing against pus and pannus, abscess and scarred vein, everyone bearing his body like some separate, stricken animal, its disappointments inevitable. It seems impolite for us to notice the fact we are the same age. His silver handcuffs, track marks, the inefficiency of my exam, a rising smell of hot dung from the old lady in the next bed. Once, when realms were not distinct, celestial and earthly, angels visited, God wed, women ministered, bathed the feet of sinners, dough muzzled the saints' hands, and this would be the moment of cloudbreak revelation. There are no figs or honey here, just betadine and isopropyl pads. So yeah, I mean, I think warm and intimate feels correct for the person performing it because you are literally in someone else's body, which
Mm,
is, which is 98.6 degrees. So I mean,
right.
yeah, but yeah, aside from my wife's poem, yeah, that just felt that it is also those two lines, in addition to being more evocative than any of the others, they are metrically more effortless. And you
Well,
also notice that they're filled with polysyllabic words in a way that a lot of the other lines are very correctly and carefully stacked, monosyllables or two-syllable words. So there's something that the sound of the poem got into his ear by the time he wrote those lines.
I mean, I don't want to. I think Joanna's lines have a particular power, and I don't want to sort of drag Joanna into this picture, but like I certainly see why you're comparing her. Why you're comparing? Is it W or is it R? Sorry, it's
C,
R. Oh,
C,
sorry, C.
yeah,
It's C. I'm so sorry, C. Whatever gender you turn out to be, you genderless being. But yes, no, I see why you're comparing C's lines to Joanna's, and yeah, I warm and intimate as surgery was a simile that struck me with its power.
yeah.
But like, I guess I was just unsure because I just didn't have enough knowledge of surgery to
Yeah,
perfectly believe. Like
but
I
I also
wanted
think like
to.
part of what is so effective is that of course it's warm and intimate are words we associate with lots of activities. We don't associate them with surgery, although they are,
Right,
if you have your hands inside somebody else's body, nothing is warmer, more
right,
intimate than that. But it is
exactly.
also, it's so correct in the context because you're talking
Yeah,
about a con man. Like
yeah,
there
yeah,
is
yeah, yeah.
something about that he's doing this coldly, cruelly,
Yeah,
without any care for the human being there, but he's deep in the psychological, emotional woods
yeah.
of this individual without caring about it the way most people are when they bother to get that close to someone. So to me, it's like that those two lines do so much of the work of the poem
Mm,
that they, in a way, like they embarrass some of the earlier, very thinky stanzas by sort of cutting through with such an with the immediacy of their recognition, right? You read those lines and you say like, oh God, this is I get what we're talking about here. And it makes me, yeah, it makes me want to say like, you do such a smart job of thinking aloud in this poem, and yet that is so much the lesser task that this poem can perform.
and yet I'm not sure if I completely agree with you because I also feel like many of the lines that are thinking aloud have a kind of repulsion, not just in their sound but also in their thinking, that adds to warm and intimate surgery. I think, like, I don't know,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
do
no,
think
yeah, yeah. I don't mean that
by
you should get rid of them all, but
yeah,
I wonder about how much the to me this is like my what my instinct said when I read this poem was like be careful with the tetrameter because
yeah,
you're starting to cram, and it may be that tetrameter is just right, but it's a very tight clip.
yeah.
Rhyming tetrameter quatrains that's a really tight box. Rhyming
Mm,
AB, not even rhyming ABXB. So be careful about the tightness of that box you're building. But then also my thought was like 25 to 30% less concept.
mm.
Like take away a little bit of the completion of the whole very, very smart psychological observation that you're making and allow the poem to do lyric work in the way that
I'm
it does so effectively in those lines.
I'm gonna be very aggravating in
Please.
a kind of incel heterosexual manner. And like, if you get to read the poems of your wife, I'm gonna read the
Oh,
poems of
please.
my dream non-existent girlfriend, Emily Dickinson.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm gonna read this poem, and I think this is, I think, 16 lines long, but I think line 9 to 16 especially capture, I think, the supreme version of what this poem is doing, not in terms of concept, but just in terms of form and technique. I'm going to read the whole poem because I think the whole poem deserves to be read, and I think what I'm trying to demonstrate exists within the contents of the whole poem. But I'm going to read the whole poem because I think it's a
Yeah,
beautiful poem, and
yeah,
and
yeah.
it deserves to be read. So this is Emily Dickinson. That after horror, that 'twas us that passed the mouldering pier, just as the granite crumb let go our saviour by a hair. A second more, that dropped too deep for fishermen to plumb. The very profile of the fort puts recollection numb. The possibility to pass without a moment's bell. Into conjecture's presence is like a face of steel that suddenly looks into ours with a metallic grin, the cordiality of death, who drills his welcome in. And I think line 9 that begins the possibility to pass without a moment's bell is like a face of steel, blah 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 blah. I think like that is it's certainly not doing quite the same as what this poem is doing, but it's certainly constructing an argument. It's constructing a kind of lyric argument, an argument of images, an argument of emotional motifs. And I think the brutality of those lines, and not just the tetrameter, but the way they arrange their concepts slantwise to the tetrameter, the way they arrange their concepts brutally and yet harmoniously in tandem with the beat. And I think like that is ultimately, when I talk about meter and concept almost merging into each other in a poem, that is ultimately what I'm after. Like a kind of merging of expression and form to the point that form becomes expression.
Yeah.
And maybe Matthew, you will find that too mystical or sentimental to
No,
understand.
no.
That's certainly where I start out with,
Yeah.
I think.
I mean, and I will confess, I often find Dickinson's poems so compressed as to be challenging. But what I will also say about them is that she pretty consistently thinks with her heart. That she's very smart, and she's
Mm,
makes these brilliant observations, but she commits within the poem to thinking by way of evocative expression rather
right.
than by thinking by way of sort of the articulation of an abstraction.
Yeah.
She embodies it in a way that is felt, so that it is why
Mm,
I say she thinks with her heart. And I think here, um, there's part of me wanted to ask because there is something like, what is this poem getting at? Part
yeah.
of the poem is getting at a couple things. One is that people who are that the con man is aware of a genuine gap in human experience.
Uh-huh.
That we know that we can't ever know anyone else. And so even though we feel empathy for others, we are aware on some level that some of that is an illusion, or is an attempt, is an approximation, and it's never really a true. It's not like we're literally plugged directly into someone else's thoughts and feelings. We always have to guess at them a little bit, even if we're guessing
Uh-huh.
instinctively. The con man also has this strange experiences this strange contradiction of having like a deep intimate understanding of others, of possessing something like empathy, but
Mm,
being emotionally unaffected by it. This was, I think I had an exchange with a listener ages ago about cold and versus warm empathy. And I think in a way, this poem is a great study of the tension between cold and warm empathy. That is, empathy that cognitively understands the interior of others versus empathy that feels the
yeah.
interior of others. And I think both sides of that are really worth exploring. It does, to me, feel a little bit like this poem may suffer from not committing to fully evoking one of those experiences.
Mm,
'Cause even, I mean, it's funny, by the time we get to the to Conman's own experience,
yeah.
it's very cursory. The depiction, his
Right.
bliss alone above the storm confirms his choice to never be. I feel like even that
Yeah.
image is very tossed in, and I don't know, well, what does it mean to say he has a choice to never be? What is it? What is the bliss above the storm? That's not an especially convincing image
To, to, to,
intuitively.
to defend line 12, I will say that I think line 12 works quite well on the pun one. I think it's in, I don't want to say line 5 in case I'm wrong, but I think it's in line 5 when he says, yeah, to love one, comma, one must apprehend. And in line 11, he says, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, in line 11, he says, his bliss alone above the storm. In line 11/12, he says, his bliss alone above the storm.
So
No
I think
line.
that's 15, 16.
Oh, so my apologies.
Yeah.
In line 15/16, he says, his bliss alone above the storm slash confirms his choice to never be. And I think that's a very nice pun on one, on that, like he, in his complete totality to the fictional, he has eliminated himself from the one. I think the storm, as both like an image, as both an evocative image and as both a kind of trope thrown in at that moment, I think is both too late and slightly too random to quite land. And I don't think it quite helps the 1/B.
Yeah, and it doesn't. It also doesn't help that it's the second part of a rhyming pair.
Right.
We feel the strain for the rhyme.
Yeah. But again, in this poem, and this is why maybe uncharacteristically, I don't want to seem too much like an asshole, and I want to seem like a nice guy. I'm simping for the poem, but like, I don't know, like, there are so many fascinating, I think, just conceptual moments that the poet has managed to transform into moments of metric and rhyme and techne. That, like, for all its flaws, I think the poem to me is infinitely interesting.
Oh, right. I mean, this is, I think, a very good example of a poem that, although I'm not convinced it comes off as a whole, it is so crammed with fascinating moves and choices and feats and little surprise. Even just sort of the line break. His words are true line break expressions, not a fact or heart. I'm not convinced by the operation of those 2.5 lines, but what he wills his words to do. But I marvel at the feat of the lines. I mean, there's so much in this poem to admire. I mean, I think this is maybe a good example of, like, as we've talked about before, when you're looking at like a poem to accept for a magazine, your standards for what you're looking for are a little bit different. And this is one where I think I might say, like, there's so much interesting stuff going on here, and like clearly this is somebody who's capable of really interesting work. I might be inclined to publish it, even if I think it doesn't totally succeed as a poem.
Oh yeah,
in part just to encourage further submissions.
Oh, definitely, and also because I think, many writers are flawed, and I think many writers can't quite get away from their own flaws, and I think it's worth acknowledging that and accepting human error. But a poem like this, for all of its flaws, displays such a facility and curiosity, and also an ability to understand human consciousness, that I just think to ignore it or to not publish it would be, I don't know, it would be an oversight, and I think a pretty meaningful aesthetic oversight. So, my comment would be before Matthew, before the motherfuckers at the new magazine you're editing get you to say it, I was gonna say, before they fucking say it, bro, before they say it, my magazine is open to the writer of this poem, edited or not edited. We're waiting for you to submit, and don't listen to anyone else. That they're all lying.
Well, I can't. Yeah, I'm not on the poetry end of Tar River, so I can't. I can't solicit for that end. Send this to Literary Matters.
You're too easy. I'm joking. But
maybe like a parting thought I have about this. One is just another poem that came to mind was the Donald Justice's "The Tourist from Syracuse," which is a kind of about a man who is a void, a man he's an assassin, but he's sort of like it's Justice's portrait of an empty, an empty face, a man who is nothing. That was my conversation with Cameron. To hear the rest of what we have to say about C's poem, as well as a whole lot else, go to SLEERICKETS.substack.com and check out The Secret Show. You can reach me, as always, at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com with your complaints, questions, observations, and if you would really like to listen to The Secret Show, but you have a hard time paying for it, write to me at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com and I will hook you up. I did get a lovely offer from listener Joe to fund a Secret Show scholarship, or to sponsor a Secret Show membership for another listener. So I got to figure out how that would work. But thank you so much to Joe for that kind offer. And there's a lot of great stuff on there for all of you to enjoy. And Joe wants you to enjoy it too. All right, with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.